Welcome back to Emotional Runway, the entrepreneur's guide to mental health. Today is a very special episode because Krista and I have the opportunity to talk to Suneel Gupta, author of the book Backable, and also the guy who coined the term emotional runway. So I appreciate him letting me steal that. It's going to be a great episode. Take a listen. Krista, how are you today?
I'm well. How are you doing, Matt?
I'm doing well, thank you. I am very excited today because we have a very special guest with us.
Very special.
Indeed. So without further ado, we will welcome Suneel Gupta to join us. Suneel, thank you so much for being here.
Matt, it's a privilege.
I can't tell you what a cool moment this is for me because just to give the audience kind of the quick backstory. So I think I've mentioned a few times that I worked at CNN Medical News with Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who is Suneel's brother. Had the chance to meet Suneel a couple of times over the years that I worked there. But he also is the author of an amazing book called Backable. And in the time when I sort of put my first posts out there on LinkedIn about how I was struggling with things, this was the next book that I had picked up and started to read. And really just, I think I emailed you probably a dozen times as I was reading it, just really helped me kind of put everything in perspective. And you actually had a chapter in there called Emotional Runway, which is where the name of this podcast came from. So just to give everybody the quick kind of backstory there, but thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you.
I'm happy to be here, and I've enjoyed sort of what you've done with Emotional Runway and the podcast you built and just the content you're putting out. I mean, I think it's always interesting when we put out content almost to help ourselves. In fact, for me, writing was therapy. I literally started to write because I felt like I needed, some type of outlet. And what I kind of realized is that the page always listens. So if you can sit down at your desk in the morning and you can just start to write, you'll always be heard. And so that's kind of how I started to get into writing. And I can see through your work that you're kind of doing a little bit of the same thing. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you're really sort of wearing it on your sleeve and putting out sort of the things you're struggling with and dealing with. And I think that maybe is helpful to other people as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, I started this because I was looking for this type of resource and it didn't exist. And, given my journalism background, this is what I knew how to do. And this is kind of what I defaulted to. And so I said, look, I actually know how to do something about this. We're very lucky in the sense that, we're recording this podcast at my office at University of Alabama, Huntsville in an incubator that is called I2C. And the founder of this incubator, I should say the director, Rigved Joshi, saw my post and said, we have a building full of entrepreneurs. How do we help these people? Because what you said really struck a chord with me. So,
Wow.
I'm thrilled to be able to help them. I'm thrilled to be able to help myself through this. And I tell Krista, I think we talk about this every episode, that this feels like therapy to me. So
Yeah, but I think that's so interesting too. That you didn't start writing and start putting this stuff out there so that you could get an incubation space at the University of Alabama.
right.
That just happened, and I think that I think really sort of gets to something that I'm starting to realize myself, which is that oftentimes when we have goals, if we miss that goal, we sort of feel like we have failed. But the reality is that oftentimes we put things out there with no idea what will come from it. And as it turns out, sometimes is the thing that actually does come from it, in the long term at least, can actually be even better.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you on that. And, I think that was what I really didn't have any idea what that was going to lead to, posting all of that stuff on LinkedIn, and actually felt very vulnerable to put it out there in the sense that, for really all the reasons we've talked about, which is, you have investors who see your LinkedIn, and when they do diligence on you, they're looking at those things, and you don't want anybody to say, oh, this guy he can't hack it because, he talked about how hard this is. And, I think this is one of the things that I try and hit on regularly, is to say that just because it's hard doesn't mean I can't do it. I'm just identifying that it's hard and that other people are probably feeling the same thing.
Yeah. And I think the thing that I pull from your posts and in your work as well is you're not just sharing that it's hard, you're sharing what you're learning along the way, right? And I think that there's an important distinction there. One of my sort of go-to sayings and mantras that I keep repeating in my head is that long-term success comes from short-term embarrassment.
Yeah.
Right. If you can learn something from it,
Yeah.
right? I started 3 companies. 2 of them failed, 1 of them worked. And the one that worked pays the bills, but the 2 that failed are the ones that actually taught me the most.
Right.
Like, I think, I don't know if it was Bill Gates or someone else who said that success is a lousy teacher. And I think that's true, right? Like, we learn the most from the mistakes, from the setbacks, but learn is the operative word. Like, we have to use these experiences to grow. We can't just sort of dwell on them and feel sorry for ourselves, because that's not growing.
Right. Well, and one of the things, that I think is so fascinating. So, again, I don't, to be honest with you, I don't know that you and I have actually ever met in person. Like we've known of each other for so many years. I've met your lovely wife, Lena, a couple of times, and obviously I know everybody else in your family, but I don't know that you and I have ever met in person. But, Sanjay always joked that you were the more successful Gupta brother, and, you were out there killing it when you were working for Groupon. And then I heard you started this, the startup Rise that you talk about a lot in the book. So that was always sort of the opinion that I had, that, everything you touched turned to gold. And then you started the book talking about how you were on stage at FailureCon, and I was like, well, wait a minute, this is not. Yeah. I think I had the wrong story here. So, talk to me about what that was like too, because like as you just alluded to, you had two companies that didn't succeed, and one that did. But you've been through both sides of that, and what's that been like?
Yeah, it's funny, Sanjay's 10 years older than me, and so he's kind of like he's a third parent in my life, and certainly as a kid, and even now as we're adults, and I think parents always have to sort of like tell you about the success, right?
Yeah.
To sort of brag about their kids, but oftentimes as parents we sort of like hide the other stuff, and I think that's true generally about the world. Like, you look up the people you admire on Google, what you're going to find most likely is a lot of the good stuff. You're going to find their profile, you're going to find sort of the their LinkedIn, you're going to see some headlines about their successes. But there's a lot of failures and setbacks that never get covered. They certainly don't pop up to the top of the page on search results. So we missed that part of the story, and yet I think that part of the story is so vital. So I got a phone call about 10 years ago from the organizer of a conference who was really trying to fix that. And what she said to me was, "Hey, we're doing a conference on failure, and get this, Matt, you have been nominated twice to be a keynote speaker at this conference." Right? And like I said,
thanks.
yeah, hey, thanks so much. Let me get this straight. I've been nominated not once but twice to be a keynote speaker for a conference on failure. Yeah, and and for good reason, right? I had started 2 companies that didn't work. I had joined Groupon early on, and Groupon at one point in time was seen as a huge success story. We were growing faster than Facebook, faster than Amazon, faster than Google. Forbes magazine called us the fastest growing company of all time. And then really within a period of just a few financial quarters, we lost $17 billion in market value. I mean, it literally just came crashing down, and we never really got that back. Pretty devastating,
Yeah.
And so that's 3. In my book, at least as an entrepreneur at that point in time, I was like 3 strikes.
Mm-hmm.
I started 2 of my own. I had joined one that I thought was going to work, didn't. So I'm up on stage giving this talk about failure, and really just trying to sort of wear it on my sleeves. I figured if I accepted the role, then I should just do that part. I shouldn't try to, put lipstick on a pig. I just tell it like it is. And I didn't realize this, but there was a reporter from the New York Times in the audience who was sitting there taking notes. And so fast forward to a full-length article on failure with my face
Right.
as the head shot in this article. And what's more than that, Matt, is that the article goes viral. I mean, literally, there was a point in time when you could have just Googled the word failure. Like, that's it. Just literally just the word failure.
Literally the picture in the dictionary.
My face would have been your top search result. So think about that for a second. Like, I come from a family where like we're pretty driven. We're very ambitious, and always want to achieve sort of big things. And I think a lot of that comes from parents and immigrant mentality, and for such a long time, my entire modus was not just to succeed, but to be seen as a success. And now, literally, I am the poster child for failure. But I think I think that somebody really important to me at that time sort of gave me this piece of advice, which we just talked about, which is that long-term success comes from short-term embarrassment. If you can do something with it, if you can learn something from it. And so what I decided to do, and this changed my entire life, is I started to email this article to all of these people that I admired. People who didn't know who I was, but I would literally just cold email them or their assistants or whatever email address I could get a hold of. And I would say, hey, as you can see from this article, I don't know what I'm doing. You know, would you be willing to give me some advice? And the response rate to that email was just extraordinarily high. Oscar-winning filmmakers, celebrity chefs, leaders of iconic organizations, founders of unicorn companies, like people wanted to chat, and that was 10 years ago, and those conversations have never really ended. I've over the past 10 years now, past decade, I've had hundreds of these conversations with what I think are some of the most extraordinary thinkers and leaders and entrepreneurs around the planet. And I've gotten to learn the habits that have sort of gotten them there. I've also have been able to apply those habits to my own life. When I did, I finally started a company that worked. I landed a job at Harvard Medical School teaching these habits to, people around the globe. And I had a chance to write that book that you were talking about. So it's been a wonderful journey.
Suneel, can you go back for me and tell me a little bit about what I consider the internal and external resources that you, I guess, leveraged in order to get through those times where you had those two companies that, let's say, failed?
Yeah. Well, I wish I could say that I handled that better, Krista, but I didn't. When those two companies failed, my sort of take was, all right, let's put those away. Let's move forward, right? And to me, I kind of in some ways look back on that as sort of almost like a classic approach to resilience, right? You fail, you get knocked down, you get back up, and you move on, right? But I think there's a researcher out there, and her name is escaping me, but she does some wonderful work, and I can follow up, Matt, with the link in Krista. But there's a difference between resilience and what this researcher calls post-traumatic growth.
Yes.
Right. Whereas resilience is the act of just sort of getting up. Post-traumatic growth involves reflection. It involves actually looking at what happened, processing what happened, accepting in some ways what happened, but most importantly, to actually learn what happened. And that didn't happen for me until much later on when I started to have these conversations with all of these leaders who I realized also failed. And again, when I pull back the layers and I started to look at their failures, what I realized is that the steps after those failures happened wasn't just moving on. It wasn't just, well, let's get them next time. It was, let's take a look at what happened, a very careful look at what happened. And let's take real time here to reflect on that. Let's journal about it. Let's write about it. Let's talk to others about it so that we can really apply what we've learned.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is there's this way of approaching situations with this growth mindset or fixed mindset. I'm sure you've come across that in the work that you do. Which basically says, right, like a growth mindset is what you're describing. Can you approach situations to really ask yourself, like, what's going on? What am I learning about it? What do I bring to the table? Are you, for example, people approaching situations, are you an optimist or are you a pessimist? Generally, people that have a sense of optimism tend to kind of overcome challenges a little bit easier. And then there's that fixed mindset, which is, I'm never going to be able to do this. Like, forget it. I failed. I'm just going to pack up and kind of do something different. So what you had mentioned, in terms of people identifying mentors, I guess, in their life or trying to figure out who you maybe look up to and can really do some digging or research into understanding a little bit better about their story and how they got to what we call, like, I guess, success. Who are those people? Are there a couple people in particular in your life that come to mind when you think about that?
Yeah. Well, Matt knows one of them very well, which is my brother Sanjay, and I think the thing about Sanjay is that, he makes it look easy, but he works insanely hard. Oftentimes people come up to me and they say, let me get this straight. Your brother is a full-time reporter for CNN, but he's also a neurosurgeon, and he also writes books, and he's also a father and a husband. And how does he pull all this off? And the reality is that, like, he works really hard, like really hard, and you just don't know that sometimes because he's got this just amazing ability sometimes to sort of make it look effortless because he's on screen and he's very comfortable and he's at ease. But I think that the lesson there for me is that, Sanjay, I think, is very much what I would consider to be a heart-centered leader, right? Like, he's not constantly scrambling because I think he's letting a lot of, like, his work, like, ensue from his heart. Like, it's not that he's not studying or not really processing lots of information. He really is. But I think he has this really special ability to, I think, kind of flip from his head to his heart, back to his head, back to his heart. But, I think that he really does let his heart sort of lead. And I think that was really important for me because I was very much in my head on a lot of things. So, for example, when I was leaving Groupon, my entire world had been e-commerce. I'd been focusing on e-commerce for 4 years, and we'd gone from baby startup to large public company, and then the crash that happened after. But it was just all e-commerce. And so when I was ready to start my, give entrepreneurship a shot again, what I assumed I was going to do was I was going to start an e-commerce company. And what I did is I created a spreadsheet, and I had all these ideas in the spreadsheet, different things that we could do in the world of e-commerce, and it was like a classic business school analysis, right? I had columns, I had competition, I had market size, total addressable market, all these sort of dimensions that you look at when you think of, like, what's a good company to start, And I went and I shared this with another mentor of mine, and her name is Julie Hanna, and she looked at this spreadsheet and she looked at me, and then she asked me a question, and the question was, which of these ideas makes you come alive? And I looked back at the spreadsheet and I pointed at one of the ideas. I'm like, well, this one, because it has a great market size, it's got big market size. There's not a lot of competition, lots of white space. She goes, no. Which of these ideas, like, actually makes you come alive? And I looked back at the spreadsheet and I realized that none of them did. Like, I thought they were all good, intelligent ideas, some more than others, but none of them really made my heart sing. Mm-hmm. And so I scrapped that spreadsheet, and I really just, like, I started from scratch, and I thought to myself, like, what is it that actually makes me come alive, right? What is it that actually would make me happy, whether or not it succeeded or not? Right?
What's your passion?
Doing every day. Yeah. What's your passion, and what's your passion every day? Not just what's your passion because it's going to work. Not your passion because you can imagine the headlines that people will write if it succeeds, but what's the passion that you have when no one's paying attention, right? Like, one of my favorite sort of sayings is that character is how you behave when no one's looking, right? And I think we have to apply that to ourselves too. What is it that's going to light us up when nobody is paying attention? When nobody cares, because a lot of times that's what entrepreneurship is, mm-hmm. right? No one's looking, especially in those early days. Right. People aren't watching. You're watching yourself. And if you aren't in it, if it's not making you come alive, that's the quickest way for a company to fail, right? And that's the thing that I didn't quite realize. Again, getting back from moving from your head to your heart, in a mental way, the companies in that spreadsheet that I created all made sense, but none of them really lit me up. Right. And I needed to find something that lit me up. And that's when I decided to shift my focus from e-commerce to healthcare.
Well, and I think that's so critical because, as you said, it's lonely at the top. And especially when, unless you have a big team and a bunch of co-founders and, all that kind of stuff, it's you. And it's got to be your idea that drives it. And I think that was one of the things that I realized in my soul searching during all this is that I'm actually very lucky in the sense that what I'm doing in the drone space and helping first responders do their jobs more effectively is what drives me. And yes, the business stuff is hard, but if it weren't for the fact that I was actually feeling like we were helping people and making a difference in the world, I would have quit a long time ago, because you got to have that to keep you going. And I think, you hear the people that say, yep, I started a business, it didn't work. Now I'm going to go get a corporate job. I'm out. It's not really even about that. That would be the easy route.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I got that very much from the first time you emailed me about your idea, and which was like, it wasn't about market size. I mean, clearly drones have a huge potential. There's a huge market there. But I remember when you emailed me, there was a mission behind it. This is what I want to do because I really care about sort of these first responders and their safety and their efficacy and what they can do with their lives. And there was a clear sort of mission that came through that email. Like, I could read that email and know that you, Matt, care a lot about this, that this actually makes you come alive. One of the concepts that Sanjay and I grew up with, we grew up going to Hindu temple, and one of the concepts that comes out of Hinduism is the concept of dharma, right? Dharma. Mm-hmm. And dharma is basically your sacred duty, right? The belief is that each of us has an essence, and our job in life is to tap into that essence and to share it with the world. Pablo Picasso has this quote, "The meaning of life is to find your gift, and the purpose of life is to give it away." Right, to share that with other people. And that's effectively the essence of dharma. Well, how do we find our gift, tap into our gift, something that really makes us come alive, and then share that with the world? And the way that I sort of think about it, and I find helpful, especially in entrepreneurship, to think about, is I think that there are two kinds of success in the world. There's outer success and there's inner success. So outer success is, it's job title, it's salary, it's income, it's nice cars, it's all the things we think about in terms of what other people can see. But I think there's also an inner success that nobody can see, and that's fulfillment, that's joy, that's meaning, that's are you lit up with what you're doing. Now, I think the mistake, I think both types of success, by the way, are important. But the mistake that we make sometimes is in believing that outer success is somehow going to lead us to inner success. Mm-hmm. Right? If we get that next job, if we get that next title, if we get that next salary bump or that next exit or whatever it is that we're looking for, somehow we're going to reach this point where we're going to feel okay inside, right? And I think what we all kind of come to a realization of, some earlier than others, is that, that doesn't work that way, right? You're always going to be looking for the next thing and the next thing after that. And it becomes this sort of almost hole inside that you cannot fill if you're trying to fill it up with external accomplishments, achievements, and stuff. Again, nothing wrong with that stuff, as long as we're clear that outer success doesn't necessarily lead to inner success. However, the thing that I can say now, after studying all these leaders, hundreds of extraordinary thinkers, leaders over the past 10 years, the people who I think succeed the most and build momentum in their lives over time are the ones who start with inner success, right? Because if you can start with inner success, what is it that actually makes me come alive? What is it that actually fills me up on a day-to-day basis? The quality and the energy that you end up bringing to your work is just that much higher. And that almost inevitably leads to outer success as well.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating too, because I think that, we want to be validated by the establishment, right? You want a venture capitalist to tell you this is the greatest idea and you're going to be the next unicorn. But it doesn't necessarily, if that doesn't happen, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not a great idea or that you're not helping people. One of the things that I've struggled with a little bit in this process of fundraising is to explain to get people to understand that there is both a business case and a way to help people through all of this. And they don't, I think that world doesn't always allow for both. It certainly has to at least have the financial success piece first, and then the helping people second.
Well, leading with humanity, I think is always a good way to approach business. It's not just about one, it's about many.
Yeah.
And what type of work are you doing to impact the greater good? And when you think about finding your passion, a lot of times the work is first figuring out what are your values. That really, when you talk about your brother, and this heart-led work, a lot of that is he probably knows very clearly what his values are, what's important to him, what really gives, increases that heart rate a little bit when he looks at it or works with it or, talks about it. Those are the things we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, yeah. And Matt, to your point about venture capitalists, I think oftentimes we do have to tell that outer story, right? And I think that's okay. You know, sometimes we know we have to go in front of an audience that cares about the numbers, and that's all they care about. And it's okay to I think, tailor the story to meet that audience's needs, because ultimately it's their job.
Right.
You know, I used to sort of hold it against investors that, like, why don't you care about the mission? And ultimately I kind of came to the conclusion of, like, look, some do and some don't, but ultimately their job, you know, to their their LPs and the people that hold them accountable, is to the returns, right? And I started to accept that and realize that there can be two narratives here. There can be the narrative that you're sharing with investors, and that's a fine narrative to have, right? It's the numbers, it's the business, it's how it works, it's the market potential. But you can also have an inner narrative, right? And that's why you're doing this, right? And those two don't always have to be exactly the same, right? They don't always have to be at least focused on the same thing. With the outer narrative, it might be focused on the numbers and market size, but the inner narrative is focused on the meaning, right? What is it that got me into this in the first place?
Right. And then that's the visionary's job, is to have the inner narrative, and the CFO and to figure out all the number stuff. I want to ask you, in the process of writing Backable, you said you were able to interview hundreds of people on both sides of the pitching table, and other people that you found inspiring. Did you ever, with any of the VC types, talk about this concept of emotional runway, and is that something they look at? Is that something they take into account?
Yeah, I think investors who have joined boards are very familiar with the idea of emotional runway, right? I mean, I think, one of the things that I remember, I was talking to an investor of mine who, is still, I think one of the top investors, and I really feel like she is somebody who, like, gets into the trenches. Her name's Ann Miraco, and and she's at Floodgate, and I really appreciated not only the way she thought, but the empathy that she had for entrepreneurs. And one of the things that I think that she would say is, look, she would always be paying attention to, like, how tired are you as a CEO? Right? Like, it was one of the questions that we would talk about. She would ask me something along those lines, even if indirectly, like, how are you feeling? It wasn't just how the business is doing, but how are you feeling? And I think the reason that she was checking in on that, and again, it wasn't casual. She was actually like, I want to know how you are doing, because she saw the direct correlation between how I am actually feeling as a CEO to what the health of the business is. Right? Because if you aren't healthy, then your business can't be either. And that's just a fact. I mean, I've gone out and studied now the other side of the table. And what I've realized is that when you look at high potential people, people who have an idea that really could make a difference, or they have a skill that could really flourish into an amazing career. And you look at those people who end up building that kind of momentum in their careers and their lives and their companies, versus people who fizzle out. The people who fizzle out, very rarely do they run out of time. What they most often run out of is energy. And they just kind of get exhausted. And I think you can see that everywhere. You can see that in the companies, the startups that had really high potential, but it didn't work. What happened? Oftentimes, it's not like we missed the market or we did. Oftentimes, it's like we could have kept going, but the reason that we didn't go was because we ran out of energy, right? We didn't try to raise that extra money. We didn't try to go do that other thing that could have made it work, because ultimately we just kind of ran out of energy. Yeah. And I'm not saying it's always a bad thing to walk away, but what I am saying is that I think in our society, are so obsessed and focused on time. Right? Time management. How much can we squeeze out of a day? Like, we're constantly thinking in terms of milestones and goals and calendars and Gantt charts, and, like, squeezing time and time and time. Like, and when we're managing other people, we're thinking about their time as well. But very rarely do we actually think about energy, right? How much energy do I have in the tank? How much energy do they have in the tank? And the reason that I coined the term emotional runway is because, like, when we think about runway, again, what we often think about is time. But there's another type of runway, and that's this emotional runway. How much gas do I have in the tank? How much gas in the tank did the people around me have? Because if that's low, then we could have the best ideas, and we could have all the resources in the world, but we're still not going to be able to achieve our potential.
Yeah, absolutely. And anyone who's listening, if they want to kind of build that resilience, the work of Dr. Dan Siegel in understanding your window of tolerance, or essentially that space where you operate really well and you're calm, you're present, you're making good decisions, you're practicing good self-care, understanding, like where you are in your mental space and what you need to do to self-regulate is really important to really, I think, mastering that emotional runway, which is a critical part of entrepreneurship.
Yeah, it's such a good point. I mean, I think one of the things that's been really surprising for me is seeing how great leaders and high-performing people use recoveries to have these moments of reflection that you're talking about. I think when we realize now that we are in a state where everybody seems to be burning out, right? At some level, we're burning out, we're getting exhausted in a way that we haven't before. One of the reasons for that, I think, is because we over-rely on vacations, right? Vacations have become sort of our tool for dealing with burnout or preventing burnout. But if you look at the data, what it's basically telling us is that, like, vacations are actually a very weak instrument when it comes to dealing with burnout. Most of us return from a vacation and feel more stressed out 1 week after than we did 1 week before, right? And so vacations are great, but they're not necessarily the tool that we need. And what we find amongst high-performing leaders is that they're actually taking what I call rhythmic renewal. They're taking small, brief recoveries every single day. In fact, the average high performer takes somewhere around 8 breaks, 8 focused, deliberate breaks every single day. And that allows them for these moments of check-in with themselves. It allows them with these moments of reflection. It allows them for these moments of just pure rest, right? Which I know kind of sounds crazy if you think about it, because the world we're in right now seems so back to back to back, right? We're like clicking off of one link, we're clicking onto another, or we're constantly, if we're back in the office, we're running from one meeting to another. But one simple way that I've been able to bring this into my life and help others bring it into theirs is through what I call the 55-5 model. 55-5, which it's as simple as it sounds. It's for every 55 minutes of work, you're building in 5 minutes of rest, 5 minutes of recovery. And that recovery could be doing anything you want, right? As long as it's not work. You could be literally sipping on a cup of coffee. It could be listening to a song. If you're a meditator, you can meditate. But there's so many different ways you can take those 5 minutes. But the key is when you can have those 5-minute breaks, what that allows you to do is have these resets throughout the day. And it allows you to start, like, almost in some ways stop the bleeding of the energy depleting, where by the end of the day you just feel completely exhausted. You're lifting yourself back up throughout the day. That doesn't just have effects and impacts for your well-being, but it actually has an effect on your performance, because the next meeting that you walk into, the next creative project that you're going into, you're bringing a higher level of energy, you're bringing a higher level of imagination, and your performance, productivity, all that stuff can be accomplished just through these 5-minute transitions.
Yeah, I think that's so critical because that seems doable, right? I mean, not all of us can go on vacation, once a month, which is probably what I think we all need to, just take a break that often, but it's just not realistic. And as you said too, it doesn't actually help all that much. And then you feel behind when you get back and you're trying to catch up. And to be honest, I mean, look, I think all three of us on this podcast have been entrepreneurs, and taking vacations is hard because you can't ever really turn it off, because ultimately you're the one that's responsible for all of it. So
yeah, Matt, I got to tell you the story because I think you'll appreciate it as a producer, somebody who spent a lot of time in production. I'm shooting this show now with American Express, where I'm flying around the world and I'm meeting these like extraordinary people, from like Martha Stewart to Ben and Jerry's, and just seeing sort of their process and what are the habits that they built into their lives. And it was, it's new for me. I'm very new to being on camera, and I watched Sanjay do it for the past 20 years, but it's not something that I've done. And so the first shoot that we had to do was last year in Los Angeles, and I'm at a hotel, and I'm pretty nervous, and I get picked up by this driver who's going to take me to the studio lot. And I get into the car, and I realize that this driver is really, really stressed out. He's been fighting LA traffic, and he can just tell he's really pissed off. And so we get on the road, we get on the 405, and he is like, his stress level is going up and up and up. He's like cutting people off, he's getting cut off, he's cursing people out, and by the time we get to the studio lot, like, not only is he fried, but like I'm fried now, right? And so like, this moment where like you have to get on camera, and you got to do your best work, right? You got to be great, and you don't feel great, right? And like, I think we all like can recognize and relate to that moment where we're going to walk into a meeting or walk into a pitch, and like, we got to do our best work, but we just don't feel that way. And that's exactly how I felt in that moment. And so I'm sitting in the car with this driver, and by the way, he's like this really big guy. He's like, he's got tattoos popping up above his neck collar, and he's basically waiting for me to get out of the car. And I look at him and I say, hey, would it be okay if I just take 5 minutes before I get out of the car to meditate? And then I say to him, hey, is there any chance that you would want to meditate with me? And this guy, like, he just glares at me in the rearview mirror, like, it's almost like, yeah, exactly. He's like, he glares at me in the rearview mirror, but then he's like, okay, meditate. So I pull out my phone, and I fire up this app. I use Calm, and we'll fire up a 5-minute meditation, and we just sit there in the car and we just breathe. I'm in the back seat, he's in the front seat, and we're just breathing. And 5 minutes come up, I get out of the car, but so does he. And literally by the time I'm out of the vehicle, he has come around and he is like engulfed me in his arms.
That's awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Like big bear hug.
Yeah.
Pulls me in tight, right? And he's like, thank you. I needed that. And I look at him, and his entire energy had reset.
Yeah.
Like everything about him was different, right? 5 minutes. Like, that's it. That's all it took was 5 minutes. And so, like, I think the question that I have for us is, like, if that can happen for him in 5 minutes, then what would happen for us if we were taking those 5-minute breaks every single day throughout the day? Right? And the people that I share this with, this 55-5 model with, they'll come back to me and they'll often say, look, for the first time in my career, I feel like I'm experiencing as much, if not more, energy at the end of the day than I was at the beginning of the day, right? And like, when's the last time you felt that way? It's a pretty powerful thing. I mean, that's one of the things I learned having worked in sort of healthcare and working in behavior change, is that, like, oftentimes, we look for the most complicated solutions to solve what are real problems. But sometimes there's some simple things out there that we can incorporate into our lives that make a huge, huge difference.
No, I think that's amazing. That's an amazing anecdote, and I certainly have seen that happen. Actually, I'll never forget. It's a similar situation in that I was out, I think with Sanjay, we were out in Petaluma, California, and they had UPS drivers doing yoga before they went out on the road, and their injury rate went down like 70% or something, because they were like, just take 5 minutes to be mindful. And so it's such a powerful force. We are, one of the cool benefits of having worked at CNN for so many years is I got a lot of really fun friends and people that I've kept up with over the years who are joining us on this podcast. Dr. Charles Raison, I don't know if you know Charles, but
sure.
The one who brought myself and your brother and the Dalai Lama into the same room to talk about mindfulness meditation. So definitely something that, I think we want to focus on here, different Eastern practices and things that aren't complicated. I mean, I think all of us use caffeine in that way, and, we just drug ourselves till, we can get to the end of the day and then crash. So
what do you remember most about your time in the room with the Dalai Lama?
I can tell you exactly the answer to that question. So I was, we were in this room. It was a small hotel room in Atlanta, and it was myself and Sanjay and two of our photographers, a sound tech, and they had prepped us for this whole, there was a 2-page document, a protocol document for when he walks in the room, you say this phrase in Sanskrit and you bow your head this way and you shake his hand with both hands and you hand him this scarf and the whole thing, right? And we were all very nervous. And he walked in the room and he just came up and he slapped me on the side of the shoulder and he said, how are you doing? And I was like, wait a minute, where was that in the protocol document? And he didn't care. Like, it wasn't for him, right? It was for all of us to make sure that we weren't, embarrassing ourselves. But You literally felt the energy light up when he walked in the room, and we all felt it, and none of us could exactly explain what that was. But it was such an amazing and powerful experience because he's such a centered human being, and certainly not without his fair share of stress in his life. I mean, he's living in exile, and the whole world looks up to him. But it was just truly remarkable to be in his presence, and the things that he does every day are simple. Just like you said, it's mindfulness about everything. So it's 5 minutes here and it's 5 minutes there. But that was by far my favorite experience of all the years that I did that.
And now that you've spent all this time sort of reflecting on yourself and in your work and how we sort of succeed, like, do you ever look back on like that time and say, like, are you able to put your finger on it a little bit more about what it was about him that gives him that energy that had such an effect on you? Yeah,
it's optimism, right? I mean, it's his worldview. Which I guess, is a double-sided coin or two-edged coin, because you could say, oh, well, I'll never have that worldview. But you can also say, I can strive to be more like that. I can strive to take those steps to be more mindful. And it wasn't, and what's funny too, I think Sanjay was asking that question. He was trying to figure out, what is it? Like, what's the one thing? And there was no one thing. It was like, is it the food you eat? And I'll never forget this. He said, are you a vegetarian? He goes, I'm something like semi-vegetarian. Sometimes I eat meat, sometimes I don't.
Why are you using a French accent?
It wasn't.
This is weird.
He has a very, he's got a very, very distinct.
Calling that out, Krista.
Yeah, you're like, what is that?
Like, what is happening?
Yeah. It was he's got a very distinctive accent. But it was just everything about the way he carries himself. And I think that's a testament to the work that Sanjay's trying to do at CNN, which is to find that special spark. And I think it's so cool that you're now doing that as well too, in a different, in a totally different realm. Man, I just can't tell you how much I appreciate you coming on and sharing your knowledge with everybody. How much of a support you've been to me off the air, even though, like I said, we don't think we've ever actually met. Once you're part of the Gupta family, I think you stay there forever. So
I think Matt Gupta has a ring to it.
Matt Gupta, yeah.
Well, hey, it was a real pleasure. Thank you. I mean, it's a remarkable. One of the most fun things about, I think, just being in the working world is seeing how people that you're connected to grow and change over time. Like, I find that incredibly rewarding, right? And like, and just to see your story and how it's grown and what you're pulling together here, you and Krista, it's really important. And also I think I can see that it's very fulfilling as well.
Very much, yeah. No, and I thank you for saying that. I'm glad, I'm glad that that's showing, and I'm recovering through the process of helping others, which I think has been really rewarding in and of itself. So, again, thank you for being here. We hopefully will have you back again soon. And as you find these things out in the world, come back and tell us about them so we can share them with our listeners.
I can't wait.
All right. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, that was such a great interview. I always love talking to him. It's so inspiring to kind of hear his viewpoint on the world.
Yes, absolutely. And, it sounds like he's just had so many experiences and an ability to talk to so many fascinating people and get some really good insights onto, like, how all this works.
Yeah. Well, one thing that's cool about that family, especially because I have this perspective about that family, is that, his mom was the first female engineer ever at Ford Motor Company, which was unusual back in the day. And so they came from this world, and his dad was an engineer as well too. And he came from this world where, like, doing the impossible or doing what seemed incredible was not out of the realm of possibilities. And so I think it sort of sets you up for this idea that you can just do anything.
Well, and that's when we think about the internal resources to really kind of be resilient. You think about psychological and cognitive, and a lot of times that's what we see when we grow up, the people around us. If you have a mom and dad that are very successful and they've kind of overcome adversity, and you basically kind of internalize this message that, like, well, I can do hard things too.
Right. Yeah, and it kind of gives you this spark to say, yeah, like, I'm going to jump off that cliff too because I've seen it work before.
Well, you're more apt to take risks, and we know that the only way really to kind of succeed is if you're willing to take risks and you're willing to be vulnerable. You may not know exactly how it's going to turn out, but you are willing to take that opportunity to figure it out.
What do you think was the most impactful thing that he talked about?
So I think a couple things, one of which is in the beginning, he started off with talking about the power of just writing. And in order to get whatever's going on in your mind, your head, your heart out on paper is a really good way of better understanding yourself and better understanding how to approach a situation. The other aspect he talked about is about meditation. So he was in that taxi cab with the driver who clearly was not in a good space. And he talked about the fact that he was aware. So that's one thing I kind of want to go back to. In order to implement ways of dealing with stress or coping with situations, you first need to have the ability of being aware of what's going on in your body, what's going on with your emotions, in order to say, I got to pause here and do something about it. So the doing something about it in the work I do is then what are the skills you need to build in order to have a way to do something about it or cope with the situation. In this particular example, it was he meditated. So meditation is an example of when we are activated or we are in a stressful situation, we end up going to this place where our amygdala is activated and we go into this emotional mind, Think about being hyper aroused, we're anxious, we're agitated, we're not thinking clearly. Or we can be hypo-aroused, where we're just kind of flat and we're disconnected and we almost present depressed. If we're not aware of those things, we're not going to be able to implement strategies to regulate ourselves and bring us back to this state of calm and awareness and presence in the situation. So he was able to do that by, okay, I'm recognizing I'm really anxious. I'm recognizing this driver is kind of out of sorts here. Maybe I'll invite then a way to meditate because meditation is a way to regulate yourself. So that was really important because if there's one thing that is really important is to find your practice. This is about hard work and this is about identifying the tools you can use in order to help yourself, regulate yourself. The Dalai Lama, for example, when, he asked you the question of what made that impact, and you said his perspective or the hope he has. And meditation is something that I've adapted over about a year now. And I think the Dalai Lama would say the meditation piece, the ability to practice for years, that he is able to calm what we call the activated mind is the monkey mind. Yep. It's like bouncing all over the place. That he's put this into practice and perfected this ability to stay in that sense of calm, and that reflects the energy that you had described that came into that room that day.
But you have to build that pathway ahead of time, right? That's why they call it practice, because you have to take
absolutely
the time.
And so you do that. You can do that in a couple different ways. For me, what the work I do is people tend to come into my office to try to build those skills, build that awareness, know what kind of practice they can establish in order to do those things. Other people, and I highly recommend this, is self-directed. Go online, do some research, researching about something called type in window of tolerance exercises. Do some research on what are the qualities of building resilience, both internally and externally. Sit down and write down, what are the things that I know when I've been stressed out before have really helped to kind of bring me to a sense of calm. If there are strengths that you have, and those things can be the things that you kind of focus on every time you're coming into a place or a time that it's not easy, put in place those things and practice them on the regular. Yeah. Coping is really dynamic. It's not just a one-time thing, that you just, it's a constant evolution, and it's constantly learning about yourself. And again, practice.
Yeah. I think that's super important. And I really appreciate like sort of his, both his take from his perspective as an entrepreneur, but also the hundreds that he's talked to. And he's starting to get this, you know, sort of higher level data to show like, this is what makes successful people successful. This is what makes you, I mean, the whole purpose of the book is what makes you backable. So what makes you have the ability to walk into a room and an investor say, I want to be on that train. And I think, you know, he talks about this idea in the book, and we talked about it on the show as well too, is making sure that you have enough both emotional and financial runway to get to that finish line. And I think that's super critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And there was one thing I wrote down when I was, you know, kind of looking at his work, and it's what we do internally to succeed externally, and thinking about what are those internal things we can do. That's, to me, a game changer. And I think that it's really exciting to think of, we're on the cusp of really finally acknowledging the value and importance of being emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, physically well, and how the benefits of what we bring into our business space or whatever we're creating.
And that it's not like a woo-woo, you know, I mean, it's a lot of this is in the past has been seen as like, oh, that's weird. I'm not going to meditate, or I'm not going to do yoga. And it's like, there's, as I know from my time at CNN covering these stories, there is a lot of really good scientific research. So for those of you who...
Well, there's been stigma behind that too, course, right? Yeah. Like thinking about like meditation, you know, you get this image of like someone sitting lotus style and like it's totally peaceful, and you're in, I don't know, on some island, deserted island or something. Who knows?
Or you're with the driver of a car service on a studio lot in LA who's got tattoos all up and down his neck, and that's how you can meditate also.
Yeah, and I think just like what we're doing, I mean, Suneel, just by virtue of talking about it, is just a great way to reduce the stigma about it and make it more approachable for people, and keep people, like, get people curious about it. Yeah. You know, if Suneel Gupta is talking about it, well, maybe there's some validity to this. Right. Maybe we should look into it, and that's powerful.
Yeah, very cool. Well, thank you so much again, as always. This was a great one. I'm very excited for the next one.
Yes.
So, you know, we'll see what that brings us, but we're in the new year now. We're excited to build new habits and new pathways, and increase our emotional runway.
Yes, and our resilience.
Indeed. Well, thank you all so much for joining us today, and a big thanks to Suneel for coming in. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with anybody you know who may need this resource. And if you have any suggestions for future episodes, please reach out to us at emotionalrunway@gmail.com. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.